Hello, everyone, and welcome to this In Conversation event with the Jewish Chronicle and Brendan O'Neill. So we're going to be talking for probably about 45 minutes, and then we'll hopefully get some time for everyone's questions. So this is Brendan O'Neill. He's the chief political writer for Spite and the author of After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel, and the Crisis of Civilization. So, Brendan, I thought we'd maybe begin by talking to a little bit about how you became a sort of advocate for Israel, because I think, you know, especially in a Jewish audience, people kind of look at non-Jewish supporters of the Jewish people and Israel, and they think, how did you get into it, and why are you still doing it?
Yeah, what am I playing at? There's not enough of us, that's for sure. The amount of brainwashed people, I'm sorry to have to say it, but it's understandable because the anti-Israel animus is so relentless. I mean, it's day in, day out. If you watch the BBC, don't watch the BBC, but if you make the mistake of watching the BBC, you will see that every single night for the past 18 months, they have given millions of British people the impression that there's only one war in the world, no other war, just one, that Israel is fighting the worst, most evil war ever. It does things that no other state does. It purposely kills children because that's what Jewish people do. Every single night, it has pumped that into people's homes. So when I meet someone who says, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, I'm not sure Israel is the bad guy, I just want to hug that person. I just think if you have the ability to withstand that moral pressure to be anti-Israel, then you are a special person. I'm not saying I'm a special person. I'm not bigging myself up here. But there are people who are doing that, and I think that's incredibly important and wonderful that they're out there. But they are very small in number. So I am one of those people. I find myself, the more anti-Israel people become, the more pro-Israel I become. I don't know if that's just a contrarian knee-jerk reaction, but I am now all out, pro-Israel. I think it needs to completely destroy Hamas. That is a great and noble moral endeavor. And it needs to be victorious, and whatever tiny, small part I can play in making the case for Israel's destruction of Hamas here in the UK or anywhere else, I will do it, because I think this is a battle not only between Israel and Hamas, but between civilization and barbarism.
And so you already kind of, you were a strong supporter of Israel before the war, right? Has anything happened since October 7th that's kind of surprised you? I mean, I think a lot of us could have seen most of what's happened coming, but is there anything that shocked even you?
The intensity of it shocked me, because I knew the response was going to be bad. And in fact, on Spite, on 7th of October itself, when the official death toll was 20 people, I wrote a piece for Spite, and it was called A Pogrom Against Israel, because I had a feeling it was going to be even worse than we knew at that time. And in that piece, I said the response in the West is going to be bad. But I had no idea how bad it was going to get. And in fact, the thing that really made me think that I needed to write a lot about this and eventually write this book was actually the events of the 9th of October, 2023, because that's when there was a celebration of the pogrom outside the Israeli embassy in London. People gathered outside the Israeli embassy. They played pop music. They danced. They said they burnt the Israeli flag. Israel hadn't really done anything at that stage. It certainly hadn't sent ground troops into Gaza. That hadn't happened yet. That was a celebration of a pogrom on the streets of London in 2023. To my mind, it was as perverse and sickening as if people had poured onto the streets to celebrate Crystal Night. And we would remember if people had poured onto the streets of London to celebrate Crystal Night. So we should remember that they did it for 7th of October. That is not the kind of thing we can afford to forget. In Sydney on the 9th of October, people gathered outside the Opera House and chanted "Fuck the Jews." and gassed the Jews. This was a gang of radical Islamists and left-wingers chanting that on the streets of Sydney, which, by the way, is one of my favorite cities in the world. I think is the high point of Western civilization. And right there in the middle of Sydney, people were chanting that in 2023, a day and a half after more Jews were killed in one day than any time since the Nazis. So very early on, you got an impression that things were going to be even worse than you might have anticipated, and that people were going to go even more crazy than you thought. So from 9th of October onwards, I just watched it get worse and worse. And I'd just seen people across the Western world take the wrong side in this clash. This is a clash between a democratic state and a barbarous militia, between the Jewish homeland and an army of anti-Semites. And people are taking the wrong side everywhere you look. The left is taking the wrong side, the people in the academy and universities, the activist class, the cultural elite, bloody kneecap, everyone is taking the wrong side in this clash. And I watched that happen immediately after 7th of October and get worse and worse and worse. And so that's what shocked me. Not necessarily that people were anti-Israel, but the intensity of it and the longevity of it has been really shocking.
I don't want to ruin the book for people who hopefully will buy some, but you write towards the end of the book about how if the Battle of Cable Street happened now, you think the reaction would probably be a bit different. And I guess I wanted to maybe speak a little bit to that, but how far do you think we've come since the sort of rise of fascism in the 30s in this country to a point where now there's a lot of left-wing people that are standing on the side of, I guess, the oppressors in this context?
Yeah, I think there have been mini cable streets almost every week for 18 months. We've seen, do you remember when the police said to that guy in Edinburgh, can you please hide your Star of David necklace because you might trigger people? Excuse me, what? In the UK, in the 21st century, Jews have been told to hide their Jewishness by the police. The police have since apologized for that, but what is an apology worth when something as obscene as that happens? We've also seen people protesting outside JW3, screaming in the faces of elderly Jewish women, making them cry as they're trying to attend cultural events. There have been protests at synagogues. In other countries, synagogues have been burnt to the ground, like in Australia and in France. There have been cable streets every week. And the left that loves to talk about the Battle of Cable Street, which fantasizes that they would have been on the side of the working classes, the Jewish working classes and their allies against Oswald Mosley, they've been on the opposite side to the one they think they would be on. They've been on the side of the Hamas maniacs. They've been on the side of the radical Islamists. They've been on the side of the Jew haters. They've been on the side of the people screaming, stop killing children in Southend-on-Sea in Essex. A few weeks ago, there was a pro-Palestine march in Southend-on-Sea where people marched through the streets carrying dolls covered in blood and covered in bloody shrouds. And they were shouting at Jewish people who were returning from synagogue, stop killing babies. That is the blood libel resuscitated for the 21st century. It's been 900 years since the blood libel first emerged, which was in Norwich, in England. Our country has the great dishonor of being the origin of the idea that Jews love to kill children. And Jewish people in England are still being faced with people carrying bloodied dolls in bloodied shrouds, holding them up in Jewish people's faces and saying to them, stop killing children. Now, anyone who wants to try and tell me that that's a political protest, that's normal politics, that falls within the realm of radicalism. Absolutely not. That is BS. That is anti-Semitism given a kind of bit of politically correct spit and polish. It's anti-Semitism under the cover of challenging Zionism. It's anti-Semitism resuscitated through this kind of obsession with Israel and this obsession with hating Israel. So, and the left supports all of that. The left either nods along to all of that or turns a blind eye and doesn't talk about it. So I think there have been Cable Street battles every week and the left's been on the wrong side. And the thing about the Battle of Cable Street is that it is that moment when the British working classes held back the tide of British fascism and sent a signal to the world very early on that if this monstrous ideology were ever to come to England, it might actually come a cropper. That was the message that the working classes sent to the world. The Jewish residents of East London and also their allies in the Irish working class and the English working class, they sent that message to the world and they made good on that. But then I cycled down Cable Street on my way to the spiked offices in Canary Wharf. I cycled down Cable Street shortly after 7th of October. And from every lamppost on that street, there were Palestine flags. And I remember just feeling so depressed that on this street where the Jews and their friends held back the tide of British fascism, there now flew the flag of a fascistic act that had just taken place. There now flew the flag not of the Jews who were killed on 7th of October, but of the people who killed them. And that, I think, told such a depressing, interesting, important story about the changing nature of London, the changing nature of our city, our politics, and even about the possibility of solidarity, which I think sadly is withering. So, yeah, I think that remembering the Battle of Cable Street is quite a useful way to understand the failures of the left right now.
And kind of on the subject of failures of the left, why do you think there's such like this crazy cognitive dissonance where you get kind of radical left-wing people who, you know, consider themselves very progressive and, you know, very morally superior and all that stuff, and they find themselves very comfortable supporting people that have very hardline Islamist views? You know, sort of everyone always makes fun of the sort of queers for Palestine thing, but where do you think that comes from in the left, and why is there this tendency to kind of sympathize with really radical kind of elements of Islamism?
Yeah, it's crazy. I talk about queers for Palestine in my book. I make the point that if they ever went to Palestine, their pronouns would be was, were, very, very quickly. And they don't seem to appreciate that. They don't seem to appreciate that they are marching shoulder to shoulder with people who would throw them off the top of a tall building given half a chance. They just, or maybe they do realize, and they're so consumed by that kind of fashionable self-hatred that they don't care. But it's weird. It's a suicidal alliance. The Islamo left is, which is a term that originated in France, but it's an apt description of what's happening here as well. It's a suicidal alliance between a left that has lost faith in humanity, that has turned its back on some of the founding principles of left-wing politics back when it was a good form of politics, you know, the principles of reason and enlightenment and fairness and equality. The left has jettisoned all of those in favor of the cruelty of identity politics and grievance politics and that kind of bitter new politics that the left now represents. And as a consequence of that, it's moved ever closer towards radical Islamists who share the left's disdain for Western civilization, who share the West's disdain for modern society itself. And I think there's an unholy alliance between those two groups. But there are huge contradictions. So when you see these protests in Europe, where you see these kind of half-naked kind of trans activists with blue hair and they're dancing, they've got nothing on and they're dancing with the Palestine flag, and you think, what are you doing? If you did that in Gaza City, you would just be dead. You would just be stoned to death. I mean, what is going on here? It's a very strange thing. But it's also, you know, the cognitive dissonance, I think, also goes to, you know, we have a left that fancies itself as anti-racist, and yet it supports one of the most evil racist movements on earth, which is Hamas. We have a left that spent years saying that, you know, white kids eating sushi is cultural appropriation. You shouldn't eat sushi, or you shouldn't do yoga, because if you do yoga, you're stealing the culture of Hinduism, etc. And now they all walk around with a keffiyeh on, dressed up like, you know, pseudo-Arabs and, you know, dabbing their tears with their keffiyeh and all this kind of stuff. So they just become parodies of themselves. And they cannot see the extraordinary contradictions in their politics, and even worse, the kind of suicidal nature of the alliances they've made, where they have become so consumed by hatred for one nation which, by the way, happens to be the world's only Jewish nation. What a coincidence. They become so consumed by hatred for that one nation that they're willing to align with movements that would literally kill them if it had the opportunity. And that is how deranged, I think, that's how deranged an ideology Israelophobia is.
Mm. And I first became aware of you, I think, in 2015 when you were writing about like campus cancel culture and the sort of nuttier things that were happening on universities. Do you kind of think that all of this is a kind of downstream of that? You know, like you wouldn't get the insane alliances that you're talking about if we didn't start at that point, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right. Josh interviewed me for the Tab magazine in another life about campus censorship and kind of the craziness on campuses. And campuses have been going nuts for years and years. They have been embracing all sorts of crazy politics and a very censorious politics, and identity politics. And I think the great losers from identity politics are Jewish people and women. And in fact, the thing that really strikes me is the two things that seem to unite left-wingers these days is their hatred for Jews and women. It really is extraordinary. They've got two policies. Basically, the radical left has got two policies. The right of Islamists to invade Israel and the right of men to invade women-only spaces. I mean, those are basically the two issues that really get them going. You remember the Supreme Court ruling from a few weeks ago saying that a woman is a biological woman. They were all like, okay, everyone knew that apart from Keir Starmer. And they went on the streets protesting. Say, how dare you? They were screaming and crying on the streets. That's how lunatic they've become. There was a placard in Manchester, in St. Peter's Square in Manchester, saying, we'll pee wherever we want. This is St. Peter's Square, where the working classes once gathered to protest for the right to vote. And they were shot dead for doing so. It gave rise to the Peterloo massacre. And now you had these kind of bourgeois, blue-haired weirdos, some of whom waving the Palestine flag, of course, gathering for the right to urinate in the women's toilets. You think, what is going on? In the Spectator, I said it's like we've gone from Peterloo to Portaloo. It's, where are these, where are these obsessions coming from? But those are the two great passions of the modern radical left. Their two great passions are hating Israel and hating those uppity women who think they should have the right to their own spaces. They hate Israel and they hate J.K. Rowling. That is the great unifying hatreds of the modern left. And you just think to yourself, listen, if you spend all your days having a pop at the Jewish nation and Jewish people and moaning about women who just want to have their own spaces away from men, then you have seriously, seriously lost the plot. And I think that's indicative of the kind of campus culture that you and I talked about years and years ago, and which lots of people have written about, the kind of lunacy of the campus culture, which now has reached dangerous levels, because now it's reached the levels of becoming much more menacing, much more threatening, and it's kind of reaching this horrible pinnacle in just a resuscitation of Jew hatred. And I think that is probably the kind of nadir of this kind of crazy post-class left politics that we've seen. And
what do you think about this idea of the kind of the omnicause, right? I think people have written about it where, environmental justice is climate justice, is, justice for the Palestinians, and all these things get lumped into one place. Do you think that blurring of lines is a sort of a tactic of, maybe you pick off some people who say, oh, I like the environment, I'll jump on board with this, and you try and get them on everything as well? Do you think that's sort of like a recruitment initiative?
Yeah, well, it's summed up in someone like Greta Thunberg. God bless Greta. She's gone from wanting to save the planet to wanting to save Gaza. Who's going to save us from her? Warbling on. That's what I want to know. We need a new campaign, save us from Greta. But it's like, it's the surge for that omnicause that in their eyes explains everything. The whole world and every problem in it can be explained by this one issue, by climate change or by something else or by the wickedness of Israel. I actually think there's a real kind of consistency in someone like Greta Thunberg shifting from the climate change issue towards the Israel issue. There's a moral consistency there actually, because both wings of those politics, in my view, have a very apocalyptic feel to them. So on the climate change arena, there is a tendency to see that this is the end of the world as we know it. Mankind is propelling us into this hell of kind of, burnt down forests and billions of people dying and all this kind of stuff. So there's this kind of search for the cause of the apocalypse. And now they just project that onto Israel. So now they say Israel is the cause of all the world's ills. Israel is not only killing Palestinians, but it's also manipulating Western politics. It's controlling America. It's controlling Britain. It's got the West eating out of his hands. It's a menace to global peace. They will actually say things like this. They will actually say, none of us will be free until Palestine is free, which is another way of saying we're all shackled by Israel. Israel is oppressing everyone in the world. Now, when they say those things about climate change, you can either agree with them or disagree with them. You can have a debate. You can say, I think you're exaggerating, whatever, that's fine. But when they say it about the Jewish nation, that's when it becomes something much more darker and much more ominous, because that is a resuscitation of the ancient idea that the Jewish people were a uniquely nefarious people, that they had a secret influence in politics, that they were, it's so interesting to me that all the things that were once said about the Jewish people are now said about the Jewish state. All of them. They love killing children. That old blood libel has been resuscitated through Israelophobia. They have a unique amount of control over political life, financial life. That's been resuscitated through Israelophobia. There are dishonest people. There are slippery people. They lie. They like to tell lies. They like to make things up. That's been resuscitated through Israelophobia too. That's not a coincidence. It is not a coincidence that what some stupid hick in Norwich in 1215 would have said about the Jews is now being said by some overeducated ponce in London in 2025. That is not a coincidence. Just because one said Jews and this new one says Zionists, just because one said Jews love to kill babies and take their blood and this new one says Israel loves to kill babies and take, that's semantics. They're both saying the same thing because we are living through a wholesale resuscitation of the anti-Semitic imagination. And I think that's really the problem. The problem with the omnicause is always a bad instinct because life and politics tends to be more complicated than one cause can explain. But when your omnicause is hating Israel, that's particularly bad because that can very easily cross the line into Jew hatred, as we've seen every day for the past 18 months.
And do you think, to a certain extent, that this kind of sort of fashionable left-wing anti-Semitism gives political cover to a sort of more insidious, well, not maybe more insidious, but as insidious sort of right-wing anti-Semitism that has much more echoes of kind of, historic fascism and things like that?
Yeah, I think we have to keep an eye on right-wing anti-Semitism because it's coming back. And you see it in Candice Owens. What a nutter she is. She used to be relatively sensible. She was always annoying, but she used to say some relatively sensible things. And now she's just become a complete lunatic. But even you see it in people like Tucker Carlson, who's less explicit than her. But, when he interviews those people who say Churchill was the bad guy in the Second World War, and you think, no, he wasn't. Come on. Let's be real about this. Hitler was misunderstood. Who's that historian? Darrell, what's his name? He said, he said that the people the Jews in the concentration camps, they weren't killed, they just died. They just died because the Nazis ran out of resources to look after them. And that's Holocaust denialism, straight up, because you're denying the motive and the intention of the Holocaust, which was to kill all Jews. So when Tucker Carlson flirts with ideologies like that and ideas like that, that's a real problem. And he has a huge audience. He has a really large audience. So on the right, and of course there's Kanye West. Oh my God. Although, as you were saying earlier, that might be a mental health crisis as much as anything else. But that's a good example, right? We have a situation now where a left-winger will defend Kneecap, the Irish rap band, for saying up Hamas and for celebrating 7th of October. The day after 7th of October, they published a photo of themselves grinning from ear to ear, and they said solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. The day after, more Jews were killed in one day than any time since the 1940s. The left will defend them, but then it will condemn Kanye West because he's got a new song called Hail Hitler, and he wears the swastika t-shirt, etc. But to my mind, materially, there is no difference whatsoever between saying up Hamas and Hail Hitler. The meaning is the exact same, which is that you have a fondness for people who kill Jews. So there's so much kind of swirling hypocrisy and crossover between these two groups. But the one thing that the more hard right anti-Semites have going for them, the one thing is that they're more honest. They will say they hate Jewish people. And that honesty is actually quite refreshing. And it means that you can confront them on that level. And you can challenge their racism, you can challenge their bigotry, you can call it out for what it is, which is anti-Semitism. But the left is much more slippery. So they will say, we're just talking about Zionists. When we say Zionists off our streets, we only mean Jews who support the state of Israel, which, by the way, is about 80% of Jews. And it used to be higher than that until Zionism became a dirty word, courtesy of the kind of cultural elites. So the left is more dishonest in its anti-Semitism. When it says Zionists off our streets, we want to kill Zionists. Zionists deserve to die. They say they just mean people who politically support the existence of Israel. We all know what they mean. So yes, we are seeing a resurgence of a right-wing form of anti-Semitism. And I think the left opened the door for that. Because by making anti-Zionism, so-called anti-Zionism, the great cause of our time, they gave these right-wing anti-Semites who've been lurking in the underbelly of society forever, they gave them a way of coming back to the surface and saying, yeah, we hate Israel as well. We love Palestinians, but we all know that they are just dyed-in-the-wool Nazis. So the left, which opposes as anti-fascist, has flung the doors open for a return of actual fascism. And I think that's one of the most unforgivable things they've done.
And do you think there's also a bit of a difference as well in that, someone on the right who's, an avowed anti-Semite, they can almost kind of revel in it, right? There's a sort of like theatrical villainous nature that they may kind of slip into. Whereas you look at someone else and, Gary Lineker, for example. Gary Lineker is someone who thinks he's got very good politics, right? And that's the difference, is that people on the left that hate Israel think that they're doing the right thing and they're morally superior in a way that maybe people on the right don't.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, the left thinks it's morally superior to everyone on every issue, but especially on this issue. Look at Gary Lineker. I mean, he keeps saying that Gaza is the worst thing he's ever seen in his life. I'm sorry, Gary Lineker is literally best mates with Alistair Campbell. Right? Alistair Campbell, for those of us who are old enough to remember, lied us into a war which by every single measuring stick was much worse than what's happening in Gaza. Number of deaths, amount of regional destruction, an amount of regional chaos, the amount of terrorism that war gave rise, the Iraq war gave rise to, the number of British soldiers who died, of course, as well. On every measurement, what happened in Iraq was much, much, much worse than what's happening in Gaza. And by the way, completely unjustifiable, because Saddam couldn't actually fire a missile at London in 45 minutes. That was untrue. And Saddam had not attacked the UK. There was no justification for that war whatsoever, where, of course, Israel has every right to go after Hamas because it launched an attack on Israel on 7th of October. So Gary Lineker rubs shoulders and has chats and has beers with a man who did something far worse than what's happening in Gaza, or played a part in that, and yet still thinks he can say Gaza's the worst thing he's ever seen. I mean, it's sick-making. It's just grotesque. These self-congratulatory, narcissistic, morally superior pricks, excuse my language, who pontificate about everything Israel does without realizing that the man literally sitting next to them in the pub while they're tweeting about Israel did something worse. I mean, that goes beyond hypocrisy. That's another level. That's just another level of double standard. But also Lineker famously said that a speech that Suella Braverman did about immigration, she said, let's stop the boats. what a shocking thing to say. And he said it sounded like something out of the 1930s because she made this speech about having better border control. And then when 7th of October happened, do you know what he said? Nothing. Nothing. A thing that actually did look like something out of the 1930s. The bundling of Jews into the back of trucks to be driven into enemy territory. The rape and murder of Jewish women. The kidnapping of a Holocaust survivor. The destruction of whole Jewish families, whole Jewish towns. The decimation of kibbutzim. Something that actually was genuinely reminiscent of the hysteria and the pogroms of the 1930s. He didn't say a word for days and days and days on end. And you just think that he sums up the ridiculousness of the supposedly morally superior cultural classes in this country, where they think everything is like fascism. The vote for Brexit, that's fascism. Trump, he's Hitler. Suella Braverman saying, stop the boats, that's just like, that's Goebbels, basically. They see fascism everywhere except where it actually exists. They see fascism in every working class oik, as they would look at them, who votes for Nigel Farage, or who takes a punt on Donald Trump, or who votes for the AfD in Germany, whatever it might be. Everything to them is fascism, except when an army of anti-Semites go into the Jewish nation and slit people's throats. That's not fascism. And in fact, what happened after 7th of October, and I write about this in my book, is that all those people who see fascism everywhere suddenly started saying, you shouldn't compare 7th of October to the Holocaust. The Guardian published a piece a week after 7th of October saying it's improper to compare 7th of October to what happened in the 1930s. This is the same Guardian that calls Trump Hitler. This is the same Guardian that said that the vote for Brexit was reminiscent of the 1930s. That's a really important development because that represents the moral theft of the memory of the 1930s, the stealing of that away from Jewish people in the Jewish nation, and the attempted ownership of it by the cultural elites of the West. What they were basically saying is, we can talk about the 1930s, we can reference the Holocaust, but you can't. That's what they were saying. And that was, to my mind, that was something worse than Holocaust denial. It was Holocaust theft. It was the stealing of those memories and that idea from the Jewish nation and from Jewish people, and the jealous preservation of it for the cultural establishment itself. And I think that's one of the grimmest turning points we've seen over the past 18 months.
And, I think it's very easy, and as you've done very perceptively in your book, to identify all the problems and everything bad that's happened since October 7th. But to try and get somewhere close to a positive note towards the end of this, is there anything that you've seen, maybe in Israel, maybe in the diaspora, that has kind of given you hope or shown the kind of resilience in the face of, such overwhelming hostility?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Israel's fight against Hamas. It's so weird because we live in such an anti-Israel climate, and it's so relentless. It's just every day you get this message that what Israel is doing is uniquely barbarous and uniquely murderous, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened. That even for people like us who take the side of Israel in this clash, even for us sometimes it can be hard to cut through all that and to think, actually, no, that's what you're saying is not true. But it's really important that we do that, because when you do that, what you realize is that what Israel is doing is not a genocide. It's not an attempted destruction of a people. It's a heroic war against anti-Semites. It's a heroic war against modern day fascism, which will be to the benefit of the Jewish homeland. It will be to the benefit of Jewish people around the world, and it will be to the benefit of Western civilization itself. But Western civilization right now is so dumb and so lost that we can't see that. But I'm hopeful that at some point we will. So in terms of things that give me hope, it's seeing those 19 and 20-year-old kids going into Gaza to fight against Hamas. I think that is incredibly inspiring. And someone posted this image of, there were 3 young IDF lads, literally 19, 20, 21, and they they found a Hamas compound and they burnt it down. and they took a photo of themselves in front of this building, which had been a Hamas weapons depot, and they burned it down, and they took a photo of themselves smiling. And this caused huge controversy all over the internet. Why are they gloating? Why are they taking photos like this? So I posted on Instagram, I said, the reason they're taking photos like this is to let the world know that you can't kill Jews with impunity anymore. There are now consequences for that. There weren't consequences in the 1930s and 40s. There weren't consequences in the 1400s. There weren't consequences in the 1200s. You could do what you like. No one really cared. You could expel Jews wholesale from your country. You could put them into concentration camps and the world looked the other way. That doesn't happen anymore. And so the Jewish state, Israel, is a really revolutionary thing. It's a revolutionary idea. And it's the thing that makes the current moment different to the 20th century, because there exists a Jewish army that means that you can't have another Holocaust. There exists a Jewish homeland that means you can't kill all Jews, even though there are some people who still would like to do that. So that, I think, is incredibly inspiring, really, really inspiring. The fact that, and I think what Israel has done over the past 18 months is actually should be inspiring to the whole Western world, because it's a nation that is willing to defend itself. It's willing to protect its borders. It's willing to stand up for its history and its traditions, and it's willing to defend its people from foreign elements on its borders that would like to kill them. The West could take a lesson from that, because we've become this post-borders, post-nationhood, post-democracy mess of a world where we don't really know what we believe in. We don't really know if anything's worth fighting for. We don't know if anything's worth putting our neck on the line for. You know, surveys show that young people in Britain probably wouldn't fight for Britain if Russia were to invade. Surveys show that. You know, the British Army put out an advert a couple of years ago saying, snowflakes, we want you. Because it says, we want your emotional intelligence. We need more snowflakes in the army. Hey, oh my God. Imagine if Putin saw those adverts, he'd be cracking up. So we don't know what we represent. We don't know what we stand for. And we have, I'm sorry to say, we have a younger generation that is increasingly fragile, that is, you know, looking at where it is on the gender ruler. Am I here? What's this pronoun? Am I this one? While there are literal radical Islamists blowing things up around them. I mean, that's actually happening. It's like the fall of Rome. You know, you have this kind of conflict swirling around, and the kind of chattering classes in the West are saying, my pronouns are they, them. It really is symptomatic of a rotting civilization. And so Israel, to me, is incredibly inspiring, because it is actually standing up for virtues and values that we should be standing up for. So I just think it's so important to push back against the anti-Israel animus and to say, it's not a genocide. It's not ethnic cleansing. It's a heroic war that will benefit mankind. And I think we should all say that.
And just finally, before we get into some audience questions, it feels, I think, to a lot of Jewish people and maybe a lot of people involved in this debate, that there's kind of no one out there who doesn't have a very strongly held and sort of calcified opinion on this. Do you ever encounter people that are kind of on the fence about this thing? And if so, you know, how many of them are still out there, and how would you go about convincing someone of the virtue of this position? Because I think sometimes, you know, if you're a Jewish person, you feel like you want to sort of scream about it and try and convince the world, but you don't necessarily know how you might do that.
Yeah, I think there probably are a lot of people on the fence. I think they need to get off the fence, come on the right side. But I think there are a lot of people on the fence. I think that a lot of people are confused. And I think that's entirely understandable, because the media coverage is unforgivably bad. Unforgivably bad. It's the worst coverage of a war I've ever seen. So it's understandable that people might be a bit thrown and a bit confused and unsure what to think. And then, of course, the message they get all the time from the influential sections of society is that if you're a good person, you wear the keffiyeh, you wave the Palestine flag, you say, this is a genocide. That's increasingly how you signal your virtue in polite society. So it's very intense in certain sections of society. So if you go to Ireland, for example, I still love Ireland despite its anti-Semitism. That's where my parents are from, and I go there all the time. But if you look at the Israelophobia and the anti-Semitism, it's much more intense in Dublin. It's much more intense. I mean, it exists around the country, but it's much more intense in those influential circles because hating Israel has become a kind of social moral currency. That is tragically one of the key ways in which you prove your worth for entry into high society, for entry into the right dinner party. And look at Sally Rooney, for example, the celebrated novelist. She does that speech at the South Bank Centre, I think it was, where she's promoting some crap novel she wrote. And she starts off by saying, we need to talk about the genocide and Israel is this and that and the other. And all the audience are rattling their jewelry in agreement and saying, oh, yes, darling. And they all agree in those circles, those literary circles, those kind of influential circles, being anti-Israel is a key element of their personal political identity, their whole culture. And that's really problematic because these are influential people. By the way, the South Bank Centre, where she did this speech, gets funding from the British government, which has been responsible for more death and destruction in the Middle East than Israel over the past 20 years. So just think about the hypocrisy of that. We have these well-off literary elites in a British government-funded institution looking down their noses at Israel because it dared to fight back against the army of anti-Semites that killed 1,200 of its people. I mean, just grotesque. If you were writing a satire of the chattering classes, that would be the opening scene. And it's shocking that no one has done that yet. So yes, it's really an intense fervor in the cultural circles and influential circles, and of course on the activist class and in campuses and so on. But I think amongst ordinary people, there's uncertainty. I'm not going to be a Pollyanna and say that people are secretly pro-Israel. I think some people probably are, but I think for most people it's probably confusion, uncertainty. What's really going on? I don't know. I'm just going to forget about it because it's too intense. I don't want to think about it. And there's a fruitfulness in that. I think those people can be engaged with, unquestionably, and they could be won down off the fence onto the side of civilization against barbarism. And I think that's the great cause of our time. The great cause of our time is to convince people that Israel has a right to exist, that Israel has a right to destroy Hamas, and that all of us will be better for it. So I think getting out there, making that case, however unpopular it might make us, is a really important thing to do.
Mm. So now we have a little bit of time for some questions. I'm going to say the thing that I always say to Jewish audiences: please make your question a question, not a statement of fact. Please try and keep it brief. And please, if we can try and avoid two-part questions that are secretly two questions, I'd be very, very grateful. Yes, sorry, you over there is going to go a microphone for you there.
Thank you so much, friends. And I don't think we can thank you enough for supporting us. And especially here, you definitely got a Friday night invitation, every Friday night. But my question is, in your own experience, did you find that you were able to sway people and think like you, friends and colleagues? Have you found that you've been able to change their views?
Well, yeah, swaying friends and colleagues. Some friends, yes. I've lost some friends, and I lost loads of followers on Instagram after 7th of October. Everyone said, he's gone mad. But then I've got loads of new followers, and I've made new friends. And in fact, one of the nice things, I guess, after 7th of October is that I've made new friends in the Jewish community in London. People, Blake Ezra, some of you might know him. He invited me to speak at his house shortly after 7th of October, and I thought it would just be him and a few friends, but it was like 50 people. And then from there, I did other things, and I'm engaging with people and making new friends, and that's been great. Lost other friends who've fallen down the toilet of whatever. That's sad. Colleagues, I'm lucky enough to work at Spiked, which is a magazine that believes very much in reason and enlightenment and opposition to deranged, regressive movements that hate Jewish people and women and gays, as Hamas does. So there's always been a real sense of camaraderie at Spiked as we go out into the world to make the case for Israel's fight against Hamas. But yeah, it can be difficult. You know, it can be hard. And I find public debates with pro-Palestine people, I always have to do pro-Palestine like that, because if you were really pro-Palestine, you would support the destruction of Hamas. So I don't understand how these people can call themselves pro-Palestine. Having debates with them is very difficult because they are so locked into that worldview and they are so convinced of their almost a godly superiority over everyone else. There's actually nothing you can do. It's very hard to cut through that. And they, you know, someone like Owen Jones, for example, I mean, he openly says, I have no doubts whatsoever, as if that's something to be proud of. You know, doubt is the engine of thought and experimentation and freedom. He says, I have no doubts whatsoever. I know Israel is committing genocide and I'm on the right side of history. I'm sorry, but history has a nasty habit of biting you on the arse and proving you wrong. And these people thought they were on the right side of history about two things, the trans question and the Israel question. The trans question has just completely fallen apart, courtesy of the Supreme Court ruling. So maybe they weren't on the right side of history. I feel confident that at some point, history will reassert itself on the question of Israel versus Hamas. I really feel that. It might take some time and it will take a hell of a lot of work. But I do actually think that we will come to look at this moment where everyone was running around calling the Jews genocidal. I think we will come to look at this moment as one of the worst cases of hysteria of the 21st century. But making people realize that is really important. So that's why it is important to talk to friends, talk to colleagues, talk to strangers, and try and make them see sense.
You, sir, in the front. Oh, sorry.
Fantastic talk, may I say. Really wonderful stuff. And I'm going to ask a slightly difficult question. Do you think it's possible that Israel might be better off with a different prime minister? And will you write that satire?
If I was only good at writing satire, I would have done it years ago, because there's so much to satirize about the world we live in, but I just feel I'm not the right person. Would Israel be better off with a different prime minister? Possibly, probably, I don't know. But I do feel that when, you know, I'm not Benjamin Netanyahu's biggest fan, and there are lots of issues with which I would disagree with him on. I don't think, we didn't get into this, but I don't think of myself as right-wing particularly. I still think of myself as left-wing. I know that's crazy. But there you go. What a strange world we live in. Those labels don't really have that much meaning anymore. But I wouldn't be Benjamin Netanyahu's biggest fan politically. But I do think there's a problem when Israel is in such an existential battle. I think anything that causes division or tension within Israel is potentially problematic. Because a nation needs to really pull together when it's at war with such an existential foe. And so when I hear friends of mine and people I know and people I trust and people I think are very, very sensible when they say, you know, I support Israel, but Netanyahu's got to go, I just think I'm not sure that's the right approach right now. And it would cause divisions and tensions and political chaos potentially in Israel, which I'll tell you who will exploit that. The armies of anti-Semites that surround Israel and all the tossers in the West that we've been talking about, they would exploit the hell out of that tension and that division to weaken Israel further. So Israel's internal strength or sense of mission, even though it frays here and there, and that's perfectly normal and it goes up and it goes down, But maintaining that strength of unity and strength of purpose is incredibly important.
And then you touched upon the British government. And I just wonder, do you have a certain concern with regards to looking at the British government or local governments, London mayor, enabling every 2 weeks, this bi-weekly, going on the street of tens of thousands of people who shout nothing but hate and anti-Semitism and racism and things that are illegal by law? My concern is I don't feel as secure or as safe here anymore if the government, the local government, and law enforcement are not there to protect me. And that's totally shock.
Yeah, those marches that took place, are they still going on? Oh, God, give it a rest. They're just ceaseless. But yeah, those every second week, I think they've been taking place. And I remember the early ones that took place after 7th of October. I went to some of them strictly to observe them. And I went to one, I'm not joking, I'm deadly serious. I was there for about 20 minutes. And in those 20 minutes, I saw someone with an Israeli flag being chased down the street and kicked. And I saw a group of young radical Islamists chanting for the return of the army of Muhammad to kill the Jews. That was in 20 minutes. So these were hate marches. There's no question about that. These were not progressive marches. These were not anti-war marches. They were pro-war marches. They were in favor of Hamas continuing its war against Israel and continuing its murder of Jews. So they were pro-war marches. They were hate marches. There's no question about that at all. And I think there were many instances over the past 18 months where Jewish people just felt they couldn't go into London. They felt they couldn't go into the center of London because these were taking place. And you would see people wearing the green bandana of Hamas, and you would see people chanting about the return of Muhammad to kill the Jews, and you would see the destruction of the Israeli flag. I mean, it created such an incredibly hostile climate, and too few politicians were willing to talk about that. Too few politicians were willing to say, this is a problem, and this is creating a climate that is problematic. Now, I am very much in favor of the right to protest. I'm very much in favor of freedom of speech. Those are two of my core beliefs. But I would like to have seen more counter-protests, which we're now seeing with Stop the Hate and Our Fight and other groups who are counter-protesting and really annoying the kind of Palestine protesters. It's very funny to see. More counter-protesting to create that sense that actually you don't own these streets. Your hatred doesn't have free reign in London. I think that's the message we should have seen. But the police failed time and time again. Do you remember when there was a gang of people calling for jihad against the Jewish state? And the police said, well, actually, jihad has many different meanings. It can mean a personal... They just went on. And you think, no, I'm sorry. If there are a bunch of young lads in kafirs calling for holy war against the Jewish state, that means one thing and one thing only. That means more pogroms. They are openly calling for more 7th of Octobers, for more Jews to be killed. And the police just failed on that because they are cowards. They are cowards. And then they arrest people who wave banners saying Hamas are terrorists. So the failures of the state in at least being honest about what these marches represented and at least taking action against those who were making expressions that fall outside of the bounds of the law. Those failures, I think, are very revealing of the two-tier policing we have in this country. Do you remember when that kid up north scuffed a page of the Quran? And I think he was an autistic kid. Some young teenager scuffed a page of the Quran, and the police investigated him. And
the teacher had to go into hiding, right?
And the teacher has gone into hiding, and that kid's mother was pulled out in front of a group of Muslims to apologize for her child's behavior. There was this kind of medieval spectacle of apology because he accidentally tore one of the pages in the Quran, and the police played along with this. And yet, when on the streets of London, there are people calling for jihad against the Jewish nation and saying, come back, Muhammad, and kill these people, the police say, well, we don't really know what they mean. What? So yeah, double standards, two-tier policing, hypocrisy, failure after failure. And at some point, there'll have to be accountability for that.
With the blue hat at the back.
I'm an Israeli visiting my daughter in London at the moment. Thank you very much for what you said about the Chayalim. First one, 100% correct. People are putting their bodies on the line, and not only for the state of Israel, but for mankind. My question to you is as follows. We come under a lot of criticism during, even before the war, of our public relations, whether we never succeeded in getting the message across. What should we have done, and what should we be doing in the future, maybe, to try and sway the balance in the right direction? The second question is...
Oh, I said no second questions.
Okay. Well, I wasn't allowed to.
Go ahead.
About what should the British Jewish community be doing? To what stand should they be taking? How should they be developing an anti? If it's, I don't know, hammering the media with letters, blah, or whatever. But I think that there has to be a counter. And I don't think we're feeling that counter in the diaspora.
Yeah, that's a really good question about Israel's public relations and its presentation of itself to the world. I think I have a controversial view on this, which is I think Israel shouldn't bother anymore, because it's a lost cause. The world's gone mad, and that's not Israel's fault. And the thing is, it's such an uphill struggle to make people see sense on this question, to make influential people see sense. And even facts can't cut through the hysteria. So, people will always say 50,000 people have been killed in Gaza, which is the worst thing that's ever happened. And no facts can help them see sense. Not even the fact that almost half of those people are Hamas combatants, which makes it actually historically speaking, a normal, if not quite good, civilian combatant ratio. You can tell people that, and they either won't believe you or they just don't talk about it. It's so mystifying to me how you can watch the BBC, not to go on about the BBC, you can watch it every night, and they will say the IDF is here and it's doing this and it's firing guns. And you think, who are they firing their guns at? Why won't you mention Hamas? Why won't you show Hamas? We all know why, because the footage that the BBC and everyone gets outside of Gaza is filtered by Hamas. It's, nothing's going to get out that shows Hamas people being shot and dead in the streets. All we're getting through the Hamas ministries are stories of civilian deaths. So even something like that, in terms of Israel's PR, and that's a really good PR case that Israel, Jerry Adams, God bless him, Jerry Adams this week put out a tweet, and it got a bit of traction where he said Israel has launched more firepower on Gaza than was launched in Hiroshima, something like that. And you think, okay, you've just accidentally made Israel's case for it. Because the fact that Israel has fired more rockets and bombs and guns and everything else than the amount that was dropped on Hiroshima, and yet the civilian casualties are as low as they are, and yet it's Hamas combatants are being killed, and yet it isn't the genocide we're told it is, because the civilian casualties are rather, historically speaking, normal or low. Even though it's apparently fired as much stuff as was fired on Hiroshima, you've made Israel's case for it. You've proven that this is not the barbarism you claim it is. So, but none of that cuts through. It's very, very difficult. And I increasingly think Israel needs to be a bit more like the Millwall. You hate us, we don't. You hate us, we don't care. But that kind of attitude. It's tragic and it's wrong and it's really stupid that people feel like that. But I think maybe Israel just needs to ride that out. Having said that, I do think in Britain and other European countries and America, it is incredibly important to have campaigns against anti-Semitism and to have campaigns raising awareness about Israel, you know, to the extent that we can cut through that noise. But it is incredibly important to challenge anti-Semitism. It is incredibly important to challenge the resurgence of this ancient racism, which is happening across Europe. And the anti-racists and the anti-fascists are either not talking about it at all, or actually they're fueling it with their political ideas. So I think Israel should, I told Josh I would try not to swear. I think Israel should say, F it. We don't care. We're doing what we think is right. We don't care what some twat at The Guardian thinks of us. We don't care that there are these Gen Z people in the State Department who apparently cry at their desks. We don't care that 10,000 stupid middle-class people and radical Islamists are marching in London and saying we want more Jews. We don't care. We don't care. We're getting on with it. I think that's probably the best approach for Israel.
I'm afraid we've probably just got time for one more question. So you, sir, on the... Yeah.
I just want
Hold on, wait 1 second for the microphone.
could you comment on the very significant role of parts of the Jewish community who appear to be supporting the anti-Israel ticket, in how that makes it much more difficult to argue with unaffected friends, acquaintances, etc.
Yeah, yes, anti-Israel Jewish people. I always feel a bit awkward about criticizing them because I'm not from the Jewish community. I don't want to be wagging my finger at anyone. But what I do find the thing that I find most striking and most disturbing about that is the media outlets that only give a platform to people like that. That's the more sinister thing. You know, Jewish people can think whatever they want. Obviously, they're free people at the moment. Doesn't it? So it stays like that. What I find more sinister is that the left lift up those voices disproportionately, and they say, and you know, they will say these are the real Jews. These are the good Jews. It's so disgusting. They have this new distinction between good Jews and bad Jews. So the good Jews are the ones who say Israel's committing a genocide and I'm ashamed of it. And the bad Jews are you guys, right? That's literally what they say. And I think that does touch on a broader problem, which is that, you know, a lot of left-wing activists in the West and a lot of influential people in the West, a lot of them are just really pissed off that it's a lot harder to kill Jewish people than it used to be. That is really, when you look at what they say about the Israel-Hamas war, when they essentially say that Israel should not have responded to 7th of October, when everything Israel does is called a war crime. So when it bombs Gaza because it wants to bomb Hamas, that's a war crime. When it tells Palestinian civilians to remove themselves from a territory to save their lives, that's ethnic cleansing. Everything it does, whether it's taking the life of a Hamas combatant or trying to save the life of a Palestinian civilian, everything it does is a war crime. And what these people are essentially saying is that Israel shouldn't have responded. What that means is that Jews should let themselves be killed. That was fundamentally what the left and other sections of society said after 7th of October. Jews should let themselves be killed because it's not a big deal. That's what they said. That was the tenor of every message that was sent out by these people after 7th of October. And what Israel said is no. And what people in this country said is no. Jews will not let themselves be killed. We will stand up for ourselves. We will arm ourselves and we will fight back. And that is what is pissing off so many people in the West who prefer the image of the Jew as the victim, emaciated, maybe needing help, every now and then, maybe needing a white savior from the Gentile community. That's the image of the Jew they prefer. They hate the image of the 20-year-old tanned IDF soldier with a gun who says, let's go and kick Hamas's ass. They hate that. So this divide, that's what I find most sinister. Jewish people will have all sorts of opinions. Some will be super pro-Israel, others will be more skeptical. Fine, whatever. But the elevation of the good Jew and the demonization of the bad Jew, that is one of the most sinister things we've seen, and that really needs to be challenged.
We could do one more, and I'm going to give it to you, sir, because you've been holding your arm up for a very long time. And that's right. I dare say your arm's probably a bit tired, so we'll give it a break. Last one.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. First, I'd like to thank you for all that you've said. But I would like to ask you a question about our most revered news agent in this country, the BBC. We all pay our taxes. We all pay our duties to the BBC, to our vices. What does the BBC do to provide us with news that is verified? Because the BBC are very quick to issue verified news, which occasionally is not so verified. And I'd like to know, they, I think, have a big responsibility for the anti-Semitism in this country, as every single news bulletin is spraying us all the time. Thank you.
Yeah. The BBC has a lot to answer for. It really does. And as I was saying earlier, what is pumped into people's homes over the past 18 months is just dross. It's just, it's factually incorrect and all that stuff, but it goes even beyond that, because if you look at the reports they do from Israel, but showing Gaza, there is no substance whatsoever. It is this emotional manipulation. So Fergal Keane, he did a report the other night, and it was showing images from Gaza of emaciated children, people in great agony, suffering people. There was no context. There was no attempt to describe that this is a war. And in wars, awful things happen. That's why some of us hate Hamas, because they started a war that Israel didn't want. The people of Gaza didn't want. No one wanted it. So it's a war, and awful things happen in war. But the Financial Times did an editorial this week, and the headline was the West's shameful silence on Israel.
Quite a loud silence, isn't it?
And you just think, if only. This is the issue that the West has been obsessing about for 18 months. They talk about nothing else. For the same period of time that there's been a war in Gaza, there's been a war in Sudan. And hundreds of thousands of people have perished. Children are literally starving to death as we speak. No one in the West is aware of it. Very few people are aware of it. They certainly don't talk about it. They don't take to the streets about it. Greta Thunberg is sailing on a boat. She wants to sail on a boat to Gaza to bring humanitarian aid. Why is she not sailing on a boat to Sudan, where the need is far greater, where there is a catastrophic shortfall in aid? Do they not care about black Africans? Or is it because no Jews, no news? They have to explain this disparity in their moral focus, because it's so glaring and it's so horrific. And that's one of the great ironies of Israelophobia and anti-Semitism, of course, which is that they pose as morally superior, as you're saying, Josh. But the holes in their moral approach are huge, because they obsess so much about Israel to the exclusion of every other issue on earth. They create this towering hierarchy of suffering, with Palestinians at the very top, the only people you're allowed to care about, and every other person around the world, in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Ukraine, they don't matter a damn, because it's not the Jewish state that's causing them problems, and so therefore you don't have to care about it. So it creates this incredibly distorted humanitarian focus, and I think that's another unforgivable element of it. But the BBC is a key contributor to that, Because the message the BBC has sent, whether wittingly or otherwise, over the past 18 months is that there's only one war happening in the world. It's the worst war that has ever taken place. And it's all down to this horrible nation called Israel. To pump that message through people's radios and TVs every day for 18 months is unforgivable.
So I think that's all that's left to do is for us to thank Brendan for his time. And just before you go, I believe copies of this book are being sold for, I don't know how much, but I'm sure it's a very reasonable price, just outside. And I think Brendan's hanging around to sign a few as well. So you can get all that out there. But anyway, yes, thank you very much to Brendan and Neil.